A caravan crosses the Sir Daria and never returns. A sealed letter is torn in a border town, and with that neat rip the old balance between Steppe and Soane opens like a seam. In the hush after the wax breaks, you can almost hear the world recalculate. The road that ran from the high pastures to the turquoise domes of the Oxus cities had been held together by courtesies older than empires. Water offered at dusk, the first cut of forage given to a guest, the messenger's person safe because words must be allowed to outrun anger. When the governor of Otrar, Inalchuk, seized a Mongol trade mission and murdered the envoys sent to protest, he did not simply offend. He struck at the hinge that let strangers speak to one another without drawing steel. On a plain where the wind moved like a visible thing through winter grass, Genghis Khan received the insult and let it sink. His rage did not flare, it deepened. He understood that a law that cannot protect a messenger is not a law but a costume. The decision he reached felt less like a spark than a weight settling into place. In the camps, the bowstrings were checked, but so were the ledgers. Timber was measured and tied. Horses were counted by stamina as much as by beauty. The reckoning would be deliberate. At the edge of the desert where reeds thickened by the Oxus, the Khwarazmian realm gleamed with market order. Tax registers lined in careful Persian hands. Judges who could turn a quarrel into a precedent. Walls warmed by the afternoon sun. Shah Allah ad-Din Muhammad II ruled from Gurganj, and his mother, Turkin Khatun, drew loyalties into a web so dense that there seemed no room for intrusion. Yet the room existed. In the gaps between provinces whose garrisons were loyal to their governors first, in the long distance between the Shah's seal and the city gates that were supposed to swing to his word. Across the steppe the Mongol camps were as spare as bone and as ordered as a clerk's column. Men who could read a horizon the way scribes read a line of script mapped the river's fords by season. Thin ice that lies, thick ice that carries. Rawhide soaked in troughs, singing a low note when twisted tight. Siege carpenters from North China judged angles, by habit more exact than geometry. Jeeb and Subutai rode farther than rumor, then curled back like a thrown lash, marking the rear of a realm that thought only of its front. What came together in these preparations looked less like a storm than a seam. Stitch by stitch, the frontier was made into something that would hold. Bukhara's merchants noticed it first, the way prices began to tremble in the presence of news, the way a rumor could overweigh a bale of cloth. Samarkand's jurists noticed at last, because laws are slow to recognize the weather. Somewhere between them, in a caravanserai where lamps burned oily and low, a broker folded his hands over a ledger and admitted to himself what he would not say aloud. The courtesies were slipping. Bukhara opened to the riders with a sigh disguised as civic prudence. Its citizens had counted the jars of grain, the months of winter left, the likely cost to families whose sons might be brave but did not practice bravery for a living. In the great mosque, beneath arches whose turquoise had the softness of old rain, a proclamation was spoken in a measured voice. Those who resisted would feel the full weight of punishment. Those who submitted could keep their wells, their doors, their tools. The arithmetic of survival presented itself with the elegance of a theorem. People went home silent and set about the business of continuing. Samarkand chose differently. Its elephants stood heavy in courtyards, their ears like worn leather shields. Its walls wore crenellations like a crown. Its pride had the sleepy confidence of habit. The men on the parapets were disciplined, and discipline is a comfort until the first strange machine thuds against the earth. The Mongol ladders rose with the patience of vines. Trenches crept forward one spade at a time. The defenders learned the shapes of machines they had known only from travelers' talk, and discovered that knowledge of names is not the same as mastery of uses. They slept in snatches, their dreams bristling with sounds. The dull knocks that mean carpenters still labor. The brief hush that means men are listening to the wall as if it had a heart. Inside the markets, shutters banged when the wind came from the east. A potter trimmed a bowl with a strip of leather, counting out loud for steadiness. A boy ran along a lane with a loaf wrapped in a cloth that had belonged to his grandmother, and somewhere a young woman, marrying for the first time, set aside her wedding dress and walked to the cistern to fill jars because water does not carry itself. History takes place in rooms like these, where people do what they must under a sky they did not choose. Genghis received letters with dust caked on their seals. Has fallen, has yielded, has fled. In the halls where Turkin Khatun knew the timbre of every whisper, men spoke in maps. Raise more troops, trust the walls, cut forage, buy time. The Shah paced like a man measuring a room he has walked 1,000 times only to discover a step he has never noticed. Courage is rarely the question. The body is the question, where it is when orders are given, whether it can be seen. Authority is a grammar. Its sentences require a subject. When the Shah chose the river islands of the Oxus over the solid dignity of a throne, when he withdrew farther west to places that could not bear the weight of his name, the grammar broke. Orders that once commanded became suggestions. Suggestions became rumors. Rumors became the only thing anyone believed. On the winter islands, small, hard fires burned and boatmen ferried chests whose locks promised certainty no key could deliver. Messengers found the Shah, took a nod back across the water, and let the nod stand for law. Behind them, Otrar held until holding became a form of madness. Khujand clenched and bled, and became a story people told so they could say they were there when the world tilted. This was the turning point, and it was not a trumpet but a silence. A ruler left the place where his seal still lay on a table, and the empire learned what emptiness can do. In Otrar, the walls that had made a governor feel tall became a measuring stick for his error. The siege closed like a fist, and then opened, but not to release. Street by street, courtyard by courtyard, men who had sworn to hold out found that oaths cannot summon grain. The final rush did not look like the paintings later ages would prefer. It looked like thresholds scuffed by boots, like a woman lifting a child into the neighbor's cellar, like a clerk pressing his palm into a ledger to keep the wind from turning the page while he wrote one last neat line. And Alchuk, who had torn a letter as if paper had no memory, discovered that paper remembers better than stone. His name became a hinge in other people's stories, and hinges creak when doors open. The news of Otrar traveled out on the same roads the merchants had once blessed. It met men who had decisions to make and reminded them that decisions can be made early or late, but never without cost. Bukhara had chosen early. Samarkand had chosen late. Others chose in the narrow space life leaves when it insists on going on. A city that submits does not become new. It becomes legible to a different reader. Daragachi moved into borrowed rooms and began to ask the practical questions empires ask when they intend to stay. How many doors? How many hearths? What is the measure of a sack of wheat here, and how many days' fodder does a post require? Local judges continued to speak in legal prose that steadies the nerves. The scribe at their elbow translated courtesy into policy and policy into writ. At the gate, a tariff table changed by a fraction so small that a clever shopkeeper could swallow it for a month and still feed his children, though he would pretend otherwise in the telling. The garrison did not parade, it kept time. Posts were relieved at the same hour every day until that hour became something people trusted, the way they trust dawn to sort the colors of the world. Patrols appeared and disappeared like the heartbeat you only hear when you stop to listen. Markets reopened. A woman tested a pitcher with a fingernail and heard it ring true. A bookseller ran a finger down a column of prices and nodded to himself. The violence had not been a rumor, and the silence afterward was not peace. It was arrangement. The road itself became policy. Relay stations stood a hard ride apart, stocked by quotas that felt unfair until people noticed that the quotas were no worse than the old improvisations, and infinitely more predictable. Keepers logged fodder, tack, and horseflesh in ledgers that would not impress a poet but would make an auditor smile. A small stamped tablet, a paiza, gave a courier the right to demand a remount, and a reminder that rights exercised without restraint corrode their own metal. Chinese engineers, who trusted angles the way others trust ancestors, cited storehouses where wind and sun would keep barley viable. Persian secretaries made the numbers behave. Accuracy became a kind of mercy. In Bukhara, a cobbler cut strips from an old saddle and breathed in the smell of oil and sweat, a history of miles embedded in leather. He worked in a doorway because the light was better, and because work done where it can be seen lays its own claim to safety. A potter mended a kiln mouth and told his daughter a simple truth that sounded like a proverb. You cannot teach clay to forgive haste. In Samarkand, the dome that had caught sunlight before the siege caught it after, and men looked up and found that light still forgives more than rulers do. Jalal al-Din, the Shah's son, gathered men who preferred a brave risk to a slow surrender. He made stands on riverbanks and surprised enemies who mistook youth for emptiness. For a handful of days at a time, he restored the sensation of a center, and the sensation tugged at people's chests like homesickness. But a sensation cannot be garrisoned, and when he rode on, the air closed without holding his shape. The muezzin's call returned to minarets whose brick had been shored after cracks grew during the pushing and the fire. The voice rose clean into morning. People paused and resumed with a steadier hand. Fear did not go away. It learned its place in the day's schedule. So did hope. Caravans stretched again across the long horizon, bells muffled under cloth, silhouettes beating the dusk. At the relay stations, a courier slid from a sweating horse, took a cup, signed a slate with the clipped letters of a man who needed his hands for reins more than for flourishes, and swung up onto a fresh mount. He felt the world compress under him. A command given in the East could become a fact in the West in the time it takes grain to dry. Astronomers compared tables by lamplight and argued over the size of the year, men who trusted the slow revolution of the heavens more than the quick turns of politics. Physicians traded recipes that mixed observation with superstition in a proportion no one yet knew how to improve. Sufi dervishes stepped lightly between market stalls and spoke of a journey that had no road, and yet could be taken from any doorstep. Craftsmen studied unfamiliar joints and glazes and found in their hands the old surprise, that a thing made well in one place will fit the needs of another if the maker is humble enough to listen. Translators became valuable in a way that silver cannot rival. They were not simply bridges, they were wells. People drew from them and went away refreshed and suspicious, which is to say, human. The empire's harshness remained, but the corridors of trust reopened because someone had taken responsibility for what lay between one promise and the next. Memory always wants to simplify. It wants a storm that erases or a sunrise that blesses. The truth is neither so clean nor so consoling. Myth says the Mongols arrived like a single black wind and wiped the slate. The record shows calculated campaigns followed by flight, negotiated surrenders, and selective ruin after which routes reopened under a new master. It shows, too, the stubborn endurance of institutions that make daily life possible, scales that weigh fairly, courts that hear petitions without sneer, bridges that do not fail when the river rises. If there is a law to carry out of this country and its season of fire, it is the sanctity of the messenger. Without him, there is no treaty that means anything, no order that becomes a fact, no market that can price goods beyond the next corner. Otrar was not just an insult avenged, it was a principle enforced. From that principle others flowed as from a clean spring. Legitimacy depends less on splendor than on speed. A letter that arrives on time shapes reality more efficiently than a title burned into gold. A station stocked on a bad harvest day is more useful than 5 heroic verses about courage. Evening softens a city's edges faster than any careful mason. In Bukhara, a scribe tilts the last of the sand onto fresh ink and watches it dull to a soft mat that will not smear. Through the open arch he hears hoofbeats pass. A patrol changing hours, a courier taking the south road. The sound is ordinary, and because it is ordinary, it is the sound of life restored to its proper scale. In Samarkand, a merchant runs a finger down a column of figures and pauses over the number that will carry his household through winter. He ties a small knot in a corner of cloth to remind himself of a sum he intends to check at dusk. Far out on the steppe, where the grass bows to the same wind that bows the reed beds along the Oxus, a rider draws up at a new-built post. He drinks in 2 swallows, says a word that means both thanks and duty, and is gone before the water in the cup has cooled. Behind him the road holds. That is the quiet miracle people rarely name. Bridges hold in thaw. Tariffs hold at the gate so that a widow can predict the week. The seal on a slip of paper holds its meaning 3 towns away. The thunder has rolled on, and in its wake the air is clear enough that voices carry from market to mosque without strain. A clerk in a border town whose name the Grand Chronicles rarely speak locks a door whose iron has worn smooth beneath his hand and stands for a moment to look at the street. It is empty in the best way, not deserted but unafraid. He turns and walks home along a lane that remembers fires and will, for a while, prefer lamplight to torches. In that preference you can hear a civilization catching its breath. The map beneath those voices has been redrawn, not with a flourish but with a steadiness that suggests intention. The steppe's motion has married the city's habit, and the child of that marriage is a corridor down which goods, ideas, and obligations travel with a confidence that would have astonished the men who first tore a letter and thought the world would not notice. It noticed. It changed. And somewhere, on a high plain under a modest sky, a man who once counted only horses counts the minutes it takes for a word to become an act, and finds in that small measure a satisfaction fiercer than pride.